It was late in World War II, on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. One morning, a Japanese soldier named Lieutenant Hiru Onoda moved silently out of the dense jungle. He crouched low at the edge of a massive rice field, his eyes scanning the area. A moment later, another soldier, a man named Kozuka, emerged from the trees behind him. Together, they began to crawl on their bellies through the mud, inching their way toward huge bundles of freshly harvested rice that had been left in the field by local farmers. When they finally reached the first big bundle, Onoda carefully pulled 2 torches from his pack. See, when Onoda had first been sent to Lubang, his orders were very clear. He was to destroy the island's airfield and do everything he could to disrupt the enemy. But almost immediately, the mission had gone completely sideways. Allied forces, the enemy of the Japanese, had launched a surprise attack on the island. The Japanese forces had been forced into a chaotic evacuation, and in the confusion, Onoda and Kozuka had been left behind. They had no idea if any other Japanese soldiers had also been stranded, but for the moment, it was just the 2 of them. Even though they were cut off with no idea if they'd ever be rescued, they still had their mission. Their job was to fight, to attack the enemy in any way they could. And these bundles of rice right in front of them, they knew exactly where this food was going. It was going to feed the enemy soldiers who now occupied the island. And so, their duty was to destroy it. Onoda took a moment, then lit the 2 torches. He handed one to Kozuka. They touched the flames to the first dry bundle of rice, and it went up in a whoosh of fire. Then, they started running. They sprinted across the field, stopping every few yards to set another bundle ablaze, until the entire rice field was a wall of fire and smoke. Suddenly, gunshots cracked through the air. The enemy had seen them. Onoda and Kozuka dropped their torches and immediately turned, running as fast as they could back towards the safety of the jungle. This was their routine. It was the rhythm of their entire existence. They would launch a surprise attack, cause some damage, and then retreat back into the jungle where they could hide and regroup. It was the one thing that gave their lives purpose. They were still fighting the war, and they would continue to fight until they were either killed or rescued. They were usually very good at this, experts at disappearing back into the trees before the enemy could zero in on them. But this time was different. As they were running, with bullets kicking up dirt all around them, Onoda heard Kozuka yell out from behind him. He turned just in time to see his only companion fall hard to the ground. A few weeks later, Onoda was alone. He was making his patrol along the north side of the island, just as he always did, but the silence was heavy. Kozuka had been shot and killed during their raid on the rice field. Onoda was now, almost certainly, the last Japanese soldier left on the entire island. He knew that his honor demanded he keep fighting, even by himself. But doing it alone was a whole different kind of battle. He was exhausted. He was depressed. He was surviving on stolen banana peels and whatever scraps he could get from the local farms. It was a truly miserable way to live. And things were getting worse. Ever since the Allied forces had killed Kozuka, they had somehow learned Onoda's name. They had intensified their operations, and now they were hunting for him specifically. Onoda had been forced to abandon his jungle camp and move into a small, hidden underground cave he'd found. But even there, he couldn't escape. He could hear the constant drone of fighter jets flying low overhead, searching for him. Sometimes patrols of enemy soldiers would push into the jungle near his cave. He could hear them calling out his name, telling him to stop hiding and surrender. On this particular day, as Onoda was on patrol, he heard voices up ahead. He instantly dropped into a crouch, hiding behind a large boulder. Soon, 3 enemy soldiers walked into view. They had no idea he was there. Their rifles were slung casually over their shoulders, and they were laughing and joking with each other. But Onoda started to panic. He knew that sooner or later they would spot his footprints in the mud. They would track him right back to his hiding spot. A part of him, a very tired part, was ready for it all to be over, even if it meant being captured. But his training, his sense of duty, took over. He forced himself to raise his rifle, take careful aim, and fire. Months went by. Onoda could tell by the air and the trees that it was springtime. It had been weeks since he had seen any enemy soldiers on his patrols. He was holed up in his underground cave, rereading a worn-out letter he had kept from his family back home. Suddenly, he heard movement directly above him. Then, a voice called out his name. Onoda's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle, ready to scramble out of the cave and start shooting. But before he could move, the person above ground began to speak again. And as Onoda listened, he realized he knew that voice. It was not an enemy soldier. Slowly, cautiously, Onoda crawled out of his cave. When he saw the person standing there, the person who had been speaking to him, he just broke down and started to weep. It was his old commanding officer, the man he had been waiting to hear from all this time. And his commander was walking toward him with a group of other soldiers, friendly Japanese soldiers. Onoda struggled to his feet. He immediately snapped to attention and gave the officer a sharp salute. He asked if he was finally allowed to go home. And the officer looked at him with a sad expression and said, yes, he could. Because it turned out the date was the 9th of March, 1974. World War II had officially ended 29 years earlier. Hiroo Onoda had spent almost 3 decades fighting a war that was long over. He had been terrorizing and attacking Filipino farmers, villagers, and local police officers, all of whom he had mistaken for enemy troops. He was still living in a war that existed only in his mind. The Japanese government had presumed Onoda and Kozuka were dead years ago. But after Kozuka was killed and his body was recovered, they realized Onoda might still be out there. They sent search parties to the island to look for him. But Onoda had seen these search parties as enemy trickery, attempts to capture him. He had hidden from every single one of them. It wasn't until he heard the familiar voice of his old commanding officer, a voice he knew he could trust, that he finally came out of hiding and laid down his rifle. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, he was given a hero's welcome. But the celebration was complicated. Innocent people had died because he was on that island, believing he was still at war. He had been a hero in his own mind, but in reality, he had been terrorizing innocent people even if he didn't know it. The whole situation was incredibly sensitive. In the end, Onoda wrote an autobiography called No Surrender. He later became a rancher and moved to Brazil, where he lived until he passed away from heart failure in 2014. Around 11 o'clock at night on the 19th of April, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Frank Esco was driving his pickup truck along a coastal road in Santa Cruz, California. He had 2 of his friends with him in the truck. The road they were on was called West Cliff Drive. It was a beautiful, scenic road that snaked along the top of a cliff right next to the Pacific Ocean. During the day, the view was absolutely amazing. But tonight, Frank couldn't see much of anything. It was pitch black, and the road had no streetlights. The amazing view was completely lost in the darkness. Frank glanced over at his friends. They were both slumped over, half asleep. And to be honest, Frank was pretty close to nodding off himself. All 3 of them were completely exhausted. They had woken up early that morning, driven 50 miles from their hometown to Santa Cruz, and then spent the entire day out on the beach. Now, they were all just desperate to get home and climb into their beds. Frank, in particular, was really anxious to get back. His wife, Margaret, always waited up for him. And right now, she was pregnant with their first child. He really didn't want to keep her waiting all night. So Frank pushed his foot a little harder on the gas pedal. He sped along the dark road, trying to enjoy what little he could see of the ocean and listening to the sound of the waves crashing below. He started thinking about his wife and their baby on the way. But as he drove, he came up on a sharp curve in the road that he just didn't see in the dark. He was going way too fast. He slammed on the brakes, and the truck began to slow down, but not nearly fast enough. He jerked the steering wheel hard, trying to fight the momentum, but it was too late. The truck spun completely out of control. Frank heard his friends wake up and start screaming. He was desperately trying to keep the truck on the road, trying to pull it away from the edge of the cliff, but it was like the truck had a mind of its own. It just kept spinning towards the edge. In the last second, Frank looked out his driver's side window and saw his headlights flash across the metal guardrail, the only thing separating them from the cliff. He knew in that moment there was nothing more he could do. They slammed into the barrier with a huge crash. He felt the truck lurch forward, smashing right through the metal, and then suddenly they were weightless. He and his friends were falling off the cliff, plummeting down toward the dark ocean below. In that split second, as they were literally falling through the air, Frank squeezed his eyes shut and just screamed along with his friends. He was expecting the truck to hit the water any second. He imagined cold ocean water pouring in through the windows, the truck sinking to the bottom, and all of them drowning, completely helpless. But then, amazingly, Frank felt the truck slam into something incredibly hard. It was definitely not water. And just like that, they weren't falling anymore. There was no water pouring into the cab. Frank was completely disoriented from the impact and the darkness. He couldn't really see what was going on, but he did a quick check on himself. He seemed to be okay. He looked over at his friends, and they were also completely shaken up, but they were alive. Everyone was physically okay. Frank frantically asked them, "Are you guys good?" And his friends, still in shock, managed to say, "Yeah, we're good." Then, almost instinctively, one of his friends on the passenger side slowly opened his door. He carefully leaned out to try and see what had just happened. After a moment, the friend looked back at the other two and just said, "We're stuck on a ledge. We got caught on a ledge." For a second, all three of them just froze. It felt like if any of them moved too much, the truck might rock off the ledge and fall the rest of the way down. But the friend looked out again and said it seemed like they were stable. By some absolute miracle, they had only fallen about 20 feet down the cliff. They had landed on a wide rock ledge that jutted out from the cliff face instead of crashing all the way down into the ocean. Hitting that ledge had almost certainly saved their lives. Frank was so relieved, so amazed at their incredible luck, that he just started to laugh. All they had to do now was carefully climb out of the truck and find a way to flag down a car on the road just 20 feet above them. They were going to be okay. So, Frank's two friends climbed all the way out of the truck. They stood on the rocky ledge on the passenger side, just looking out at the ocean, thanking their lucky stars that they had survived such a horrible crash. Frank wanted to get out and join them. He decided to go out his own door, the driver's side door. But when he tried to open it, he found that it was jammed shut from the impact. So instead, he started to roll down his window so he could climb out that way. At the exact same time Frank was doing this, his friends who were standing out on the ledge turned around to look at him and see what he was doing. Through the windows of the truck, they could really only see his shadowy shape in the darkness. But they watched as he was clearly climbing out of his window, getting ready to join them on the ledge. But the instant he climbed out on the other side of the truck, the moment his body was clear of the window, it was like Frank just vanished. He was there 1 second and gone the next. For a moment, his friends were just confused. One of them called out, "Frank, where did you go? Where are you?" But there was no response. Just silence. So, very carefully, the two friends began to walk around the front of the truck to see what Frank was doing. And when they got to the other side and they saw what was there where Frank should have been standing, they were absolutely horrified. It would turn out the ledge that Frank and his friends had landed on, the very one that had just saved their lives, was not a completely solid surface. Specifically, it was porous. And in one particular spot, there was a hole. A hole just big enough for a person to fall through. And that hole was located on the immediate outside of the driver's side of the truck. That hole, the one that Frank couldn't see in the darkness when he jumped out of his window, was the entrance to an underwater sea cave. Frank had survived the incredible fall, only to fall straight into this dark cave. He had no idea what had happened. He found himself in a network of dark, wet tunnels. There was a little bit of water on the floor, but it wasn't very deep yet. He started trying to find a way out, but he quickly got lost inside the confusing maze of tunnels. His friends were up on the ledge, screaming his name. Rescuers showed up a little while later. But by the time the tide began to come in a couple of hours later, Frank was nowhere near the entrance hole. He was lost deep inside the cave. So when the water level rose, it didn't lift him up towards the exit. It just filled up the space he was trapped in. And he drowned. On the afternoon of the 19th of December, 1966, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim sat in a conference room inside a government building in Cairo, Egypt. He was there in his official capacity as an employee of the Egyptian government, and he was sitting at a table across from two government representatives from France. He felt incredibly nervous. He had been meeting with these same two men for the last 4 months, trying to reach an agreement with them about a very important diplomatic decision. But so far, they had not been able to make a deal. The reason for the stalemate was that these French representatives wanted Mohammed, who was the Director General of Egyptian Antiquities, to help them put together a huge exhibition in Paris. The entire exhibition was going to be about ancient Egypt. And specifically, they wanted Mohammed to loan them a collection of priceless artifacts from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. But Mohammed was deeply afraid to loan these specific artifacts out. He, along with many other people in his field, believed that these particular artifacts were sacred. They believed they should never be transported outside of Egypt because doing so would be deeply disrespectful to the pharaoh himself. So, on this particular day, Mohammed finally decided to be completely honest with the French representatives. He looked at them and said that they were never going to reach a deal because he was simply not willing to loan out these items. He told them it felt profoundly disrespectful to the pharaoh. He knew it probably sounded a little crazy because the pharaoh had been dead for thousands of years, but that was just how he felt. And he wanted them to understand that this wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was something he could not change. Up until this point, Mohammed had been trying to find other ways to make a deal work, but he had never come right out and said that his main objection was this personal feeling of disrespect towards the long-dead pharaoh. So this was the first time the French representatives were hearing his true reason. And from Mohammed's perspective, when he said it, it looked like they almost wanted to laugh. Like they thought he had to be kidding. But when they realized Mohammed was being completely serious, their expressions changed. They shifted in their seats and looked at him with what seemed like sympathy. Then they promised Mohammed that if he loaned them the artifacts, it would not be disrespectful at all. In fact, they argued it would do the opposite. It would actually honor the pharaoh because it would allow people all over France to see and appreciate the incredible artifacts from his tomb. Mohammed and the French representatives went back and forth on this for hours. And eventually, very slowly, Mohammed did start to see their side of things. It started to make sense to him that maybe allowing France to display the artifacts wasn't an act of disrespect, but actually a way of honoring the pharaoh's legacy. And so finally, maybe against his better judgment, Mohammed officially agreed to loan out the artifacts. The deal was done, and the meeting was over. A few minutes later, Mohammed walked out of the government building and onto the busy sidewalk outside. He felt lighter than he had in months. The stressful negotiation was finally over. He didn't have to think about it anymore. It was a huge weight off his shoulders. Now, all Mohammed wanted to do was just go home. He started walking towards the parking lot where his car was parked. He stepped off the curb to head across the street, looking straight ahead, thinking about the day. And as he did, he heard a loud, blaring horn and the screeching sound of tires on pavement. And then, everything went black. It would turn out that the artifacts Mohammed had just agreed to loan out were from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. And Mohammed, along with many, many others, believed that these artifacts were not just sacred, but that they were also cursed. This belief existed because over the years, at least 11 people who had a direct connection to the discovery and handling of these artifacts had died under mysterious or sudden circumstances. It was believed that anybody who disrespected the artifacts or the pharaoh's tomb would face King Tut's wrath. And just minutes after Muhammad finally convinced himself to go against his own gut feeling and agree to loan out these artifacts to France, he walked out of that government building in Cairo and he was hit and killed by a truck. His death made headlines all over the world. To this day, some people will say it was just a horrible, tragic accident. But others insist he was yet another victim of King Tut's curse. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One day in January of 2018, a police officer was making his way through a quiet patch of woods near the small town of Gray in France. And as he walked, his eyes were fixed on the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. This trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who had very clearly been shot in the head. Now, at first glance, this had all the markings of a suicide, but the officer had some serious questions. This was not the first body that had been found in these same woods. Another one had been discovered just a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to feel like there was a very disturbing pattern forming here. At around 5 in the evening on the 27th of October 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval was driving her car down a cul-de-sac in that same small, quiet town of Gray. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday. It was supposed to be a big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had all driven in from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away, just for this celebration. But as Alexia drove, she had to admit to herself that she had very mixed feelings about seeing everyone tonight. You see, Alexia had been going through a really difficult time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant for a while. She had gone through several rounds of fertility treatments, and the process had thrown her hormones completely out of whack. It seemed to affect her a lot more intensely than it did for most women who went through it. And then, after all of that struggle, she had finally gotten pregnant. But just a couple of months ago, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage. So, even though Alexia absolutely adored her sister's family and got along with them wonderfully, the pain of her miscarriage was still very raw. She just knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for her to be around her young nephew. He was a constant, innocent reminder of the baby she had lost. Alexia's car came to a stop outside a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac. She pushed the button on the intercom, and a moment later, the gate swung open. She drove up the long driveway toward a beautiful house with a perfectly kept garden out front. She parked her car in the driveway, right behind her father's white van, and then she got out. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a wrapped present along with a couple of desserts she baked herself. She carried them up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, stood there with a huge smile on her face. She welcomed Alexia inside and led her into the dining room. Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, was sitting at the table, deep in conversation with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and greeted her with warm hugs. As Alexia started to explain that her husband, Jonathan, was running late and would be there later in a separate car because a job he was on as an electrician had run long, she heard the sound of little feet pattering towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his little arms around Alexia's legs. To her own surprise and immense relief, Alexia didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness. All she felt was a wave of pure happiness. She bent down and scooped the little boy up into her arms, giving him a big, warm hug. Then she handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the whole family settled in for dinner. And for a while, all of Alexia's worries and sadness just seemed to melt away. She was incredibly close with everyone at that table, especially her mother and her sister, Stephanie. Just being around them always had a way of lifting her spirits. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30 that evening. He joined the family, and along with everyone else, he had a wonderful night. They ate, they drank, and they just chatted and laughed together. After dinner was all cleaned up, Alexia's father decided to head to bed, but everyone else stayed up. They all just continued to have this really nice, comfortable time together until around 11 o'clock when Alexia announced that it was probably time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in before starting her day. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She had left her own car back at her parents' house because she had been drinking wine with dinner, and she was planning to just pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was located on a quiet residential street only about a mile away from her parents' place. And as they drove down their road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, her expression soured. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer long. He had become obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't even feel safe going out for a jog by herself around their own neighborhood. Fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't know how long he would be there. She didn't know if he had already been released. So it felt more like a temporary pause than a real, long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. As Alexia walked from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill that sat in the corner of the garage. It had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he told her no, he hadn't. Alexia just sighed. The weather forecast for the next day was supposed to be very cold and gloomy. It looked like she was going to have to go for her run outside after all. The following morning, around 11 o'clock, Jonathan walked up to the front door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. As he waited, he cast a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked right where they had left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried to hide how anxious he was feeling as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. Then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she had seen or heard from her daughter recently. When Isabel said she hadn't, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He told her that Alexia had gone out for a jog that morning, but she hadn't come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he had tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered. By this point, she should have been home a long, long time ago. Something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room. They had very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what all the commotion was about. So, Jonathan frantically re-explained the situation. He asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so, but they both shook their heads and said they hadn't. Stephanie did show Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning just saying that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from her. Jonathan was openly crying by this point. Alexia's family tried to assure him that everything was probably fine. They told him Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute now, that she was likely just running late. Jonathan wanted to believe them, but this was completely out of character for Alexia. It was not normal for her to be gone for this long without being in touch with anyone. It just didn't make any sense. It was at this point that his brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. He just said, "Look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you. We can go look for Alexia together, or at least we can be together until she comes back." Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful for the offer and said yes, that would be great. A couple of minutes later, the two men got into Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan had Gregory drive through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could spot her. They drove down all the side streets, scanning for any sign of her. When they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and started checking the paths that led into the countryside. They also checked the ditches and the banks of the nearby river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. Eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house, hoping that maybe she had finally come home with an explanation for all of this. But she hadn't. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself with worry. Gregory, doing his best to stay calm for both of them, suggested that they go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance. Two nurses were standing outside taking a cigarette break. Jonathan rushed up to them and told them that he was looking for his wife, that she had gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now, and maybe, just maybe, she was here. The nurses could clearly see this was an emergency. They put out their cigarettes and went back inside to check the hospital's register. But a minute later, they came back out and told the men that no, and Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She wasn't there. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just looked at them and said, "Look, you need to go to the police." Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline Pegney sat across from Jonathan in a small room at the Gray police station. He explained to her what had happened, that his wife was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running: bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket. It would have been pretty easy to spot. And then, after describing her and sort of realizing the full weight of why he was there, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, just as he had been doing for much of the morning. Now, Officer Pegney could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason at all she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head, no. He said that overall his wife was a very happy person and was definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he added that she had been taking hormones for her fertility treatments, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, he said that sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. In other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses where she wouldn't even know what she was doing while she was doing it. It was like she had become this completely different person. Officer Pegney nodded and just listened to Jonathan, writing down everything he was saying. When he was done, she followed up and asked, "Can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia?" For a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly, his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told the officer that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arno, and he had been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number. She had even talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back, and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. Officer Pegney was obviously very intrigued by this information. So, after this interview with Jonathan was over, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arno guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly they discovered that while Arno had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true. He was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arno's mother's house, where Arno was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. When the officer asked if she was Arno's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see a disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. He asked the mother if that was Arno, and again the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arno in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute they both agreed and the officer came inside. The officer went into the house and sat down in the living room with Arno, while Arno's mother went to the kitchen to give them some privacy. Once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arno and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duval. Arno immediately looked down at this question like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder. He explained that sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, and that included Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that Arno had apparently sent to Alexia that summer. What was going on with that? Arno admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point and they had also hung out in a group setting once. So him being in touch with her was not totally weird, he claimed. They had a real connection. But Arno clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arno's phone number. So, the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arno that Alexia was missing. And then, before Arno could say anything, the officer asked him where he had been that morning at 9 o'clock. And Arno said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arno, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive. So, eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer, with a sort of bewildered look on her face, that he was here with her all morning. So at this point, it was clear to the officer that if the mother was telling the truth, it would officially rule out Arno as a suspect because he had a solid alibi. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis. Mothers are known to lie, cheat, and do just about anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Pettis glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside, down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Pettis, who was in charge of the investigation. It was still very early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every single step. Pettis closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and all the surrounding woods. Pettis' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They all claimed they had been at the house together. And so, without any real leads, Pettis had gotten so desperate for any information that he had literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Pettis sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. A moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints had actually turned up something. Pettis listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he had spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor. Apparently, there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Pettis was worried that perhaps this was just an unfounded rumor. But then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one. And her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Pettis brought his car to a stop next to a news van that was parked in the middle of the woods, about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, He had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so, Pettis had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that he was here at the crime scene, he could tell that he was late to the game because a news crew was already there, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. Pettis was disappointed to see this, because he had hoped that if and when her body was discovered dead, he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now, he obviously would not get that chance. Pettis climbed out of his car and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. He went over to one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers on the ground, and Pettis introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Pettis noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Pettis bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face. There were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Pettis noticed a couple of things that were very unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face, and so to Pettis, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Pettis think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia and not a stranger who simply accosted her during a jog. Just then, he heard his name called, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. So, Pettis walked over, and the tech showed him what he'd found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Pettis thought that maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also on Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Pettis over to them to show him something else. They had found tire tracks in the dirt. Pettis immediately thought about that tip he had been given about this van with a person driving around town harassing women and girls. And he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved, and that these tracks had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. So, as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Pettis made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other person of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. Pettis was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. So immediately, Pettis went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing there. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering, like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out there picking mushrooms. But Pettis could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out there. And so, operating on a gut instinct, Pettis pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods, Pettis sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he had just arrested for lurking near the crime scene. And Pettis was pleased. I mean, he had only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really the first suspect who was in custody. But as soon as Pettis actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away. And he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. So, Pettis pressed Anthony to explain why he was really there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain. But what he said was, he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he hadn't been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he had just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on. And Anthony said he got scared and just lied, and said he was out there picking mushrooms. He said it was just out of embarrassment. As Pettis sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Pettis followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he had woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Pettis their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Pettis stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So, despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Pettis had no choice but to let him go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. Hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who had been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So, the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. So far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. In fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months, and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Pettis, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they had been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of January 2018, Chief Officer Pettis was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head. Although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Pettis looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. A gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be that he shot himself, then put the gun in the trash can, and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head is typically immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel that distance. It just seemed very, very unlikely. So now, Pettis sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have two violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found in basically the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Pettis scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Pettis felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading. And a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. The killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so, now, they were really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they had been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they were having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on the 28th of January 2018. and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On Sunday afternoon, the 12th of March, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr., known as Mike, was riding his ATV. In Freedom, New Hampshire, he glided across a huge frozen lake. Mike smiled as the cold air nipped at his cheeks and felt sharp in his lungs with every breath. Totally enjoyed it here. Mike resided in Wakefield, Massachusetts, 2 hours away for most of the year. Freedom was his escape. His parents owned a summer home on this lake, and he had come here his whole life. He felt at home in this tiny, tranquil lakeside hamlet where his real-life stress could melt away. Mike recently took a big stride. His parents lived just down the street from his Freedom vacation home, which he acquired. This purchase was huge for him. It signified his triumph. Mike owned a Wakefield cement contracting business. He spent years creating all-state concrete pumping, countless long days, and restless nights. He wanted to provide his wife, Michelle, and 3 children a good life. This second mansion, this lakeside refuge, proved he had succeeded. He succeeded. Success was costly. His marriage was also deeply strained by his concrete industry work. As boss, he had all the responsibility and brutal hours. He traveled often. This left Michelle and the kids mostly alone. She handled most of the children, housework, and juggling while he worked. She had lately informed Mike that his frequent absence, no matter how much money it brought in, was hurting her and their family. These ideas ran through Mike's head as his ATV skimmed the ice. Success, stress, marriage. He was attempting to comprehend it. He saw it then. He saw another ATV approaching from across the lake. His gut nodded as it approached. He recognized the driver. Sean Fitzpatrick was his other marital issue. Sean was their lakeside neighbor. He was the Zamiti family's close buddy for years. He resided in Freedom year-round after retiring. Sean was always around when Mike and his family visited. He came over for dinner and barbecue. On his boat, he took the kids. Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean because he was so present. Last summer, Mike found something that ended their friendship. He discovered his wife Michelle was cheating with Sean. Mike was devastated by the finding. Everything felt like it had shifted in his universe. Despite the treachery, Steve and Michelle decided to stay married. Still in love, they had 3 kids to consider. They started therapy together to repair things. Mike and Sean had no relationship. Mike hadn't spoken to Sean since learning. Mike disliked conflict. He found it easy to avoid Sean and rebuild his life with Michelle. Mike didn't want Sean coming right for him. He instinctively throttled his ATV, turned it around, and sped off. It was too late. Sean waved him down as he slowed. Mike felt shackled. He reluctantly stopped his ATV and waited for Sean. Sean skipped small conversation. He looked at Mike and stated he was delighted he met him. He wanted to apologize to Mike for last summer with Michelle. He acknowledged it wasn't okay and hoped they could go on. Sean's sincerity surprised Mike. Mike said, "You know what? It's all good," without meaning it because he despised awkward situations. Not everything was good. However, expressing that ended this awkward conversation the fastest. Mike really wanted to leave Sean and return home. He instructed Sean to hurry because Michelle needed him to pack the car. Before Sean could respond, Mike turned his ATV around and drove it back across the ice, leaving him alone on the frozen lake. Mike entered his holiday home 15 minutes later. He observed a row of nicely packed and zipped luggage beside the door first. He smiled within. Michelle had finished everything. Soon after, she entered and kissed him. He was assured the youngsters were finishing up cleaning their rooms and would leave soon. Suddenly, a car horn beeped twice outside. Michelle rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew who it was. Must be Mike's parents. His parents spent the weekend in freedom at their house down the street. The 2-hour trip back to Wakefield was also planned. Michelle laughed because the family joke was that Mike and his father couldn't go a day without chatting. Michael Sr., Mike's father, shared more than his name. Both father and son were best friends and business partners. Mike Jr. ran Allstate Concrete, owned by Michael Sr., a true family company. Mike had never considered alternatives. He jumped right into the concrete industry after high school and worked with his dad ever since. Like any business, the company struggled over time. Previously, a former employee filed a difficult case. Overall, Allstate Concrete was a success. Today, business was flourishing. Their time and resources were being consumed by a large Boston construction project. Outside, Mike visited his folks and talked shop with his dad. He asked Michael Sr. if he had called Chester Roberts, their employee. Mike asked Chester to join him in the office the next morning with his dad. Chester was their part-time driver and handyman. He was their most reliable worker in his early 50s. Chester was the first person they called during busy weeks. Mike was relieved when his dad claimed he'd spoken to Chester. They were ready for tomorrow. They parted ways after a few more minutes of talking. Mike Jr. assured his dad he'd see him in the morning, then walked inside to pack his family. The next morning, Monday, March 13, Mike Jr. drove his vehicle into Wakefield's Allstate Concrete parking lot before 8. He arrived on time. Being the first, he saw a light rain falling. He jumped out, ran across the wet pavement, and unlocked a side door next to a huge garage bay door. The Allstate building had a huge garage. Their cement trucks could pull through its 3 massive roll-up doors. Mike and his father handled all the paperwork and administrative responsibilities in a small office on the second floor. Mike took the metal stairway to the office after entering the vast, quiet garage. He relaxed into his desk chair and considered the week's itinerary, logistics, and mental to-do list. He heard another car enter the parking lot minutes after. Mike assumed it was his father. Chester was another employee who walked to work. He lived close. Mike then heard the basement door open and footsteps go up the stairs. Another truck entered the Allstate Concrete parking lot minutes later. Senior Michael. After parking his truck next to his son's, he ran for the side door to escape the rain. He pushed the door, but it didn't open. It stuck. It opened a few inches. Confused, he looked through the crack to see what was preventing it. His blood chilled. He froze. A man lay face down on the concrete floor in a dark, spreading pool of blood. The garage was dark, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He had no idea who it was, but he knew it was not his son with painful certainty. Mike Jr. was a huge, broad-shouldered man, yet even in weak light showed a lesser physique. Michael Sr. felt his heart pounding his ribs. He could only retreat from the door, get his phone, and contact 911. Panic ensued after he hung up with the dispatcher, who promised help. He couldn't wait in the rain. A man was dead or dying in his business. His son was supposed to be there. It was his son's truck in the parking lot. He must enter. Mike had to be found and checked on. Michael Sr. staggered past the blocked side entrance and went to a wide roll-up garage door. He opened it, creating a dark, spacious entrance to the structure. He saw no one in the big garage. Running inside, he screamed his son's name repeatedly. No one answered. Mike! Mike! Just the sound of his furious speech in the vast, empty space. His son was absent from the ground floor. Michael Sr. sprinted for the stairs and took them 2 at a time to the second-floor office, his heart racing. He froze when he entered the office. The world stopped turning. Mike Jr., his son, was bloodied and collapsed in the office desk chair. After an hour, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up to Allstate Concrete in his cruiser. He saw police swarming the enormous industrial facility. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property. At least a dozen Wakefield Police Department crime scene techs and officers collected evidence by entering and exiting an open garage door. Trooper Baker was with the state police, not Wakefield. Massachusetts state troopers led homicide investigations with local police as usual. Baker believed this case needed all the aid it could get. Violence like this wasn't common in Wakefield. It was a lovely, safe hamlet 10 miles north of Boston. In this little village, everyone knew each other. Double homicides were rare here. Baker got out of his car and searched for the leader. His wait was short. Detective Richard Cass of Wakefield Police rushed over and introduced himself. Cass told Baker to follow him to the open garage bay and gave him a quick update. 2 dead men were inside. Both were shot. The company's owner, Michael Zamiti Sr., found them around 8 this morning. Baker followed Cass into the huge garage. They approached the first victim, face down on the concrete floor inside the smaller side door. Cass identified the victim as 51-year-old Chester Roberts. Allstate hired him as a part-time truck driver and handyman. It was easy to spot him. Chester was a famous local who did odd jobs around town. He was known to Detective Cass. Baker saw Chester was shot in the back as he kneeled by the body. It appeared to be a shotgun burst. Pellets showed the spray pattern. No other injuries, struggle, or defensive wounds on his hands or arms were apparent. Baker rose and surveyed the garage. He saw no robbery signs. Unused, pricey equipment was outside. Nothing fell or was displaced. Chester's killer seems to have sneaked up behind him and shot him without his knowledge. Baker checked the doors and windows for a while. There were no traces of forced entry again. It didn't matter much. Chester probably opened the building for the day, and the killer followed. After surveying the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to visit the second victim upstairs. Baker followed Cass into the second-floor office where 39-year-old Mike Zamiti Jr.'s body was found. Detective Cass whispered that he knew Mike, like Chester. This office scene was awful. Mike wasn't shot once in the torso, like Chester. Shot in the chest and face. Shotgun bursts were catastrophic. Blood covered his desk, chair, and paperwork. Mike was practically unrecognizable. Baker was struck by more than the gruesomeness. Body posture. Mike remained slouched at his desk. It looked like execution. The killer seems to have entered the office with one goal: to kill Mike Zamiti. They touched nothing else. They entered and shot him in the face before he could stand up. This was deeply personal and deliberate. Baker developed a theory as he thought about this. Mike Jr. was presumably the first casualty. He was shot before Chester got at the building. Mike would have heard a shotgun explosion downstairs otherwise. He wouldn't have sat comfortably at his desk, surprised. Mike being shot first would strengthen the perception that he was the main target. Other than the awful brutality, the crime scene was tidy. The killer left no bloody tracks, smudges, or traces of searching beyond the victims. Baker quickly considered one idea. Italian-American construction family Zamitis. Fit a stereotype. He told Cass he wondered if this was a professional mob hit. While listening, Cass seemed attentive. He said Baker he knew the Zamitis well and that Mike Jr. and his father were decent people. He didn't think they'd be involved in mafia deals. But he admitted it was plausible, especially because Allstate Concrete was one of the Big Dig contractors. Baker's ears perked up immediately. The Big Dig was America's largest and most expensive construction endeavor. A Boston Harbor tunnel was a major project. However, the project was a civic nightmare. There were accusations of mafia involvement and corrupt payoffs from the outset, and it was years behind schedule and over budget. Baker now had to consider the possibility that the Zamitis had either become engaged in those shady transactions or crossed the wrong person at work. Baker believed the killer was a business associate, even if this had nothing to do with the mob. Someone who knew the company, building layout, and that Mike would be alone early in the morning was needed. Chester, the second casualty, was probably not intended. Baker wasn't clear why Chester was slain. Due to his late arrival and witness status, he could have been eliminated. He may have been involved in the Zemidis' fight. Baker stood still, scrutinizing the bloody paperwork on the desk. He then told Cass that they needed a thorough list of Allstate's previous and present workers and clientele. While strolling around the workplace, he saw a 1.6 gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He ordered a crime scene tech to bag it and examine the building for more ammunition. Baker and Cassie returned outside. Behind the police tape, a few observers and reporters had gathered. Baker requested Cass to talk with Michael Zemidis Sr., the body finder, outside. DCAS shook his head. He said Michael Sr. was disoriented and barely able to communicate when he came due to grief and shock. Cass decided to send him home. When Michelle, Mike Jr.'s wife, arrived, another cop did the same. She hysterically claimed to have heard of an accident. When she learned her husband was dead, they took her home too. Baker accepted but wasn't pleased. Time matters in murder investigations. He preferred to speak to crucial witnesses and family members quickly while their recollections were fresh. He was sorry to miss the chance to talk to Michelle right away because the spouse is always a suspect in homicides. There was still a lot of work to do at the scene, but Wakefield police knew where to find the family. Baker advised Cass to canvass surrounding businesses for witnesses or security cameras. The next morning, March 14, Trooper Baker parked in front of the Zemidis family house in Wakefield. He and Detective Cass spoke with Michael Sr. After receiving Chester and Mike's initial autopsy reports, they didn't find anything new. Mike was shot twice, Chester once. Death struck both guys instantaneously. However, detectives had one hopeful lead. No CCTV cameras were detected on the Allstate concrete facility, but surrounding businesses had them. A team of officers was meticulously scrutinizing the clip. Another Baker team interviewed Chester Roberts' family. He could have been wrong, and Chester, not Mike, was the target. Beyond that, crime scene techs uncovered little physical evidence. There were no usable prints. The morning of the murders, it rained, so they couldn't lift any clear footprints or wheel marks from outside the structure. Now Baker was betting on Michael Sr. He knocked on the main door, hoping the heartbroken father might direct them. Baker and Cass joined Michael Sr. and Pat, Mike's mother, in the Zemidis living room a minute later. Both parents seemed shocked. Michael Sr. was shivering, as Pat sat silently crying. Baker saw them now and felt Cass had made the proper decision to send Michael Sr. home the day before. Even 24 hours later, they were too distraught to give precise answers. Baker opted to be brief. He first requested Michael Sr. to explain the body discovery again. The father gave the 911 dispatcher the same tale, all aligned. Baker proceeded to his actual purpose. He inquired whether anyone wanted to hurt Mike Jr. Michael Sr. shakily breathed. He noted that in the building industry, you sometimes encounter stiff competition. But he and his son always tried to get along with everyone. Fighting was terrible for business, he argued. But as he said this, he sat up taller, as if he had noticed something. He indicated a previous employee had a vengeance against them. It was his nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank sued the corporation a few years ago for unpaid overtime wages. They settled with Hank out of court, but the whole thing had sparked animosity. There was still much hatred. Mike Sr. glanced at his wife Pat, who nodded and said it had been difficult and turbulent. Baker meticulously recorded Hank's facts. After chatting with Mike's parents for a while, he and Cass left. Baker knew he would need to talk to the Zemidis again, but for now, he would give them room. He and Cass had a new lead. They'd investigate Hank Jennings. Baker returned to Cass's Wakefield Police Department office 2 days later to review crime scene images and witness accounts. He was getting restless. After meeting Mike's parents, he hoped Hank Jennings, the bitter cousin, would be their guy. They dispatched officers to find Hank for an interview, but they hadn't found him yet. They had reached Mike's wife Michelle and questioned her at home. She didn't give them much information. She said she was home with her kids when her husband was murdered. She claimed she didn't know anyone who had hurt him. Baker and Cass examined Allstate Concrete's financial records but found no mafia connections. Still, they were better off than a few days earlier. Detectives reviewing surveillance footage from businesses near Allstate discovered something. One security camera faced the street in front of the Allstate building. The angle wasn't right to show the company's parking lot. It recorded all street entry and leave vehicles from the parking lot. Cameras captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck arrived at 7:44. A few minutes later, Chester Roberts arrived on foot. The same green truck left the parking lot at 7:50. 12 minutes passed before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. Massive break. The killer probably drove that green truck and killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 and 7:50 a.m. The video quality didn't show the driver or license plate, but knowing the killer's likely vehicle's make and color was crucial. They could narrow their suspect list. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched Cass grab it. After listening, Cass looked confused. He thanked the caller and promised to arrive. He hung up and faced Baker. He claimed Michelle Zamidi was calling. She called to share new information she hadn't shared in her first interview. She said it was crucial. Baker and Cass sat across from Michelle in her living room again 15 minutes later. Baker saw her as a different person. She appeared horrified and grieving 2 days earlier. She looked incredibly nervous now. She fidgeted with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table, touching her hair. Baker mentioned the cards, and Michelle nodded. Many friends and neighbors from Wakefield and their second home in Freedom, New Hampshire, had reached out. Michelle breathed deeply and got to the point. They were denied information, she said. She described her Freedom neighbor, Sean Fitzpatrick. She acknowledged having an affair with him. Baker was dumbfounded. The case was transformed by a secret love triangle. Sean and Michelle had a strong reason to avoid Mike. Michelle revealed that her husband knew about the affair before Baker could ask a follow-up. She described the therapy and how they had worked hard to save their marriage. She said she broke up with Sean a month ago. She added that Sean was furious. Baker looked at Cass. They shared a thought. They must speak to Sean Fitzpatrick now. Michelle was once again the top suspect after this new information. Maybe she wanted her husband gone to be with her lover. She may have told them this now to control the story before they found out. More evidence is needed to prove any of that. Michelle gave Baker Sean's contact information and address, and Baker said they'd contact her. Later that night, Baker and Cass returned to her office. A second officer was ready to provide a vital update. Baker immediately sent officers to Freedom, New Hampshire to interview Sean Fitzpatrick after speaking with Michelle. One of those officers returned to Wakefield to report his findings. Baker wanted simple answers first. Has Sean Fitzpatrick owned a green truck? Officer shook his head. Sean had a bright red truck, he said. The officer stated that Sean denied having an affair with Michelle when questioned. He said he and Michelle were close, but just family friends. The officers interviewing him never revealed that they knew he was lying, and Michelle had confessed everything. Baker almost laughed at this. He initially doubted Sean's denial. His blatant lying made him look guilty. Before Baker could respond, the officer added another crucial detail: that Sean had a good alibi. One of his neighbors confirmed that he was at home in Freedom on the murder morning. This neighbor took a walk every morning at 9, and she remembered seeing Sean outside his house at that time. In frustration, Baker sighed. Freedom, New Hampshire to Wakefield, Massachusetts takes 2 hours. Sean could not have killed Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then at his Freedom home an hour and 10 minutes later. Physically impossible. Suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick, their most promising lead, felt like another dead end. 5 days after the murders, Baker and Cass stood behind a Wakefield church on March 18. They attended Mike Zamidi's funeral. The church was packed, showing how much the community loved Mike. However, the two investigators weren't just paying respects. They finally spoke to Mike's cousin, Hank Jennings, who sued the company. Cass suggested they corner him at the funeral since they hadn't been able to reach him. Despite the animosity, he was family and would attend. Baker felt Cass nudge him as the mourners stood after the service. He leaned over and whispered their accuracy. He pointed to Hank in the crowd. As people left the pews, the two investigators caught Hank before he could leave. Baker immediately saw Hank's body tense up as they blocked his path. He seemed ready to flee. Baker cut to the chase. His eyes widened when he said, "Hank, we need you to come with us and answer some questions." He shook his head and said, "No way." "Not without my lawyer." He pushed past them and left the church. Baker and Cass didn't oppose him. They looked at each other. They considered Hank their main suspect due to his bizarre, evasive behavior. 5 weeks passed. State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office mid-April 2006. He carefully held a single sheet of paper in latex gloves. The ransom note looked like a movie prop. The page was covered with carefully cut and pasted newspaper letters. The letters warned, "Close business now, or more family will die." They received the note from Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat. She said it arrived in their mail that morning. For the Zametti family, this letter was terrifying. It wasn't just a cruel reminder of their son's murder, it threatened more violence. The note meant something else to Baker. They desperately needed a lead. Mike and Chester were killed over a month ago, and the investigation had stalled. Most of their initial suspects had been eliminated by this point, including Hank Jennings. They discovered his strange funeral behavior wasn't guilt-related. His settlement with the Zamittis included a non-disclosure agreement, so he was afraid of legal trouble if he told the police. His alibi was solid when they finally got him to sit down for a formal interview with his lawyer. His employer confirmed that he was at work during the murders. Hank owned several shotguns, but none were 1/6 gauge, the type used in the murders. Hank joined the growing pile of suspects. Michelle was in that pile. Given her affair, she had a motive, but she cooperated throughout the investigation. They couldn't find any evidence she was involved, directly or by hiring someone. A seemingly unbreakable alibi cleared her ex-lover, Sean Fitzpatrick, the most suspicious. He could not have been in two places. This threatening, ransom-style note seemed to confirm the investigation's initial theory that the murders were business-related and mob-related. Cass, a local, told Baker that rumors were spreading. Wakefield agreed that the mob theory made the most sense due to the Zamittis' Big Dig involvement. Baker wasn't convinced. They repeatedly examined the Zamittis' financial records and found no shady deals or mob ties. Additionally, this note felt wrong. A newspaper clipping note was silly and performative, not professional organization style. It seemed like someone was trying to make them think it was the mob to derail the investigation. Even if it was a red herring, the note was shocking. Because the sender may have left fingerprints or DNA on it, Baker carefully placed the note in an evidence bag. Cass sent it to the crime lab for analysis. Baker expected lab results to take time. While they waited, he re-interviewed every suspect and witness in case they missed a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Baker sat alone at Cass's desk a few days later, reading a witness statement for the 100th time. New evidence had re-energized the investigation, and he felt optimistic for the first time in weeks. They received preliminary forensic results from the threatening letter. Better yet, the lab found DNA and a partial palm print on the paper. Now, they needed a suspect to match it. The office door flew open, and an excited Detective Cass barged in. He had news after hanging up the phone. About Sean Fitzpatrick's alibi. The neighbor who walked every morning at 9 a.m. called the station. She wanted to modify her statement. She wasn't sure she saw Sean at 9. She thought she saw him later in the day after thinking about it. One phone call changed everything. A seemingly solid alibi had collapsed. Instantly, the murder day timeline was open. Sean could now have driven from Freedom to Wakefield, murdered, and returned. After realizing this, the investigators remembered another thing. The condolence cards on Michelle's coffee table came to mind. Baker and Cass walked up Michelle Zamity's front steps an hour later, knocked on her door. They asked for permission to enter and retrieve a small object from her home when she answered. As usual, Michelle agreed, confused but cooperative. After passing her, they found the condolence card they were looking for in that pile. The card was from Sean Fitzpatrick. They thanked Michelle, carefully placed the card and envelope in an evidence bag, and left. The crime lab received it directly. When the test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Police believe this happened on the 13th of March 2006, based on the new timeline, DNA evidence, and witness statements. Sean Fitzpatrick silently climbed Mike Zamity's office's metal staircase at 7:45 a.m. He carried a 1.6 gauge shotgun and had a racing heart. He was anxious but determined. His mind told him Mike Jr. must go. The only way, he entered the office without hesitation. It opened, and he raised the shotgun. Mike sat at his desk. He turned when the door opened and saw his neighbor, his wife's ex-lover, with a gun pointed at him, shocking and confusing him. Sean shot Mike in the face and chest before he could react. Mike sank in his chair, dead. Sean ran down the stairs, adrenaline rushing. However, he froze at the bottom of the stairs. He heard outside footsteps approaching the building's side door. Others were coming. Sean instinctively hid in the shadows of the large garage, his mind racing to see who it was. A man entered shortly after the door opened. It was Chester Roberts. Sean jumped out of his hiding spot and shot Chester in the back before he could react. Chester fell silently. Sean stood stunned for a moment. He hadn't intended to kill again. Mike alone was targeted. Now another body lay on the floor. He couldn't stay. More people may arrive at any time. He ran from the building and jumped into the green pickup truck he stole from a Freedom neighbor who was away. He left the Allstate concrete parking lot in under 10 minutes. He drove with white-knuckled steering wheel grip. He felt terrible about what he did and knew he should feel guilty. However, he only felt profound relief. Now, he believed he could be with his soulmate. When Michelle tried to break up with Sean, she told him she would only leave her husband if Mike did or suffered. Michelle did it to end the affair and let him down easy. Sean saw it as a suggestion and green light. So he did something to Mike. The pieces fell into place after Sean's alibi collapsed. He licked the envelope of his condolence card to Michelle, leaving DNA that matched the ransom-style letter. Sean wrote and sent that letter to deceive the police into thinking the murders were a professional mob hit. June 2006 saw Sean Fitzpatrick arrested. After being convicted of murdering Michael Zamity Jr. and Chester Roberts, he received 2 life sentences. The Zamity family had to deal with the loss of their son and the betrayal of a friend. Chester Roberts' family mourned an innocent man who was killed for arriving on time to work. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you.